Hello and welcome. My name is Pooja. This podcast is a space for serious conversations about ideas, how they emerge, spread, fracture, and shape the world we live in. In this episode, I am joined by Professor Steven Pinker, Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, and one of the world's leading public intellectuals. Professor Pinker is the author of several influential books, including The Better Angels of Our Nature, Enlightenment Now, Rationality, and his latest work, When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, which explores the concept of common knowledge and its role in coordination, norms, and social order. Our conversation ranges across common knowledge, rationality, cancel culture, the breakdown of shared norms, geopolitics, academia, and why pessimism about progress still persists despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. These conversations are optimized for ideas. Let's begin. Hello, everyone. I am joined by Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University today, Professor Steven Pinker, who is going to be talking about multiple topics with me, ranging from common knowledge to rationality to the cancel culture and probably why so many people are single nowadays. Let's dive in. So, on your new book, When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, ... And I'm going to let you explain the dots rather than me doing it. Frankly, I thoroughly enjoyed that book. It differentiates common knowledge from common sense. It tells us why people coordinate, how they coordinate, how those coordination games work, introduces new concepts, at least for me, like the theory of credible signaling, hawk and dove games. I, in fact, bought a book on games of strategy right there after reading after reading your book. So please tell us about your new book.
Yes, it's about common knowledge in the technical sense of the word, which refers to the state in which not only do people know something, but they know that everyone knows it. And that's what the title of the book captures: When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows. The reason that that is an important distinction is that common knowledge in this special sense is necessary for coordination, for two people to be on the same page, to be able to make choices that benefit both of them as long as they both make the same choice. A simple example is driving on the right versus driving on the left. There's no reason to pick one or the other, but it's very important that everyone makes the same choice. And moreover, you have to know not only that it's the law to drive on the right or the left, as the case may be, but you have to know that everyone else knows it. Otherwise, you'll do what everyone else does. Another example is just a simple rendezvous at a cafe. If your cell phone goes dead and you have to meet someone, it isn't enough to know where they're likely to go, because they're thinking where you're likely to go, and they might be thinking what you're thinking about where they're likely to go, and so on, to nothing short of technically an infinite number of levels of I know that she knows that I know that she knows is sufficient to get people to make coordinated choices. Now, of course, no one can cognitively handle an infinite series of I know that she knows that I know that she knows that I know that she knows. Your head starts to spin after about 2 or 3 levels. But common knowledge can be granted in one stroke if something is self-evident, if it's public, if it is salient, if it is out there. That is, if you see something and you see other people seeing it while they see you seeing it, that can grant common knowledge in one stroke. So I like to illustrate the power of common knowledge, and I open the book with the famous story of the emperor's new clothes, because that's a story about common knowledge. When the little boy said that the emperor was naked, he wasn't telling anyone anything that they didn't already know. They could see the emperor was naked. But he changed the state of their knowledge nonetheless, because by blurting it out within earshot of everyone else, now everyone knew that everyone else knew that the emperor was naked, even though they didn't have to think through all the layers. And finally, the punchline of the story, which was that the generation of common knowledge about the emperor's foolishness changed the people's relationship to the emperor from deference and respect to ridicule and scorn is an example of how our social relationships are coordination games, a little bit like rendezvousing at a cafe or driving on the right versus the left. Namely, two people are in a relationship of respect or of friendship or of romance or transactional partners, because each one knows that the other one knows that they know that the other one knows that they are. That's what it means to be friends. You don't sign a contract when you become friends with someone. It's just that you know that they know that you know that they know that you're friends. And so on with relationships of authority or dominance. The dominant individual stands his ground because he knows that the subordinate will back down. The subordinate backs down because he knows that the dominant will stand his ground. It's a matter of common knowledge, which can be challenged by some threat to the person's dominance or status that is itself common knowledge. So common knowledge drives, I argue, our political, our financial, and even our social and emotional lives because it's the basis of relationships of coordination. Okay, I've gone on maybe a bit too long, but that's the idea behind the.
That's a fantastic answer. To be honest, I was expecting the Friends example, but I'm glad you went to the political side because then that takes me to my next question. In the story you begin with, the emperor's new clothes, it's a very common story. We hear it when we are children. But when you grow up, you realize that the instruments that create common knowledge, media, books, conversations, even algorithms in the age of social media, they're divided or captured. There are certain media houses which cater to certain ideologies for whatever reason, best known to them. And on the other hand, algorithms show you what you like, creating uh, separate tenets of common knowledge for everybody. So giving you different priors and creating conflict. How does one get past that, in your opinion?
How do we get past that?
Yes.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I have a solution to this major global problem. Um, because it's not just a matter of which sources you get information from, but which sources you trust, that is, you consider to be authoritative. And whereas it was easier when there were fewer channels of communication, and the channels were controlled by big responsible organizations that had to cater to a wide audience, like the BBC, like the three networks in the United States, like sources like Time Magazine, the New York Times, uh, that had to appeal to a wide audience. That began to fragment, especially in the 1990s, when, at least in the United States, cable TV started to replace broadcast TV. With broadcast TV, there were 3 channels. With cable, there were 500 channels. And then some of them could take over a niche of appealing to a political faction with stories that flattered them, that demonized the other side, and if they got 40% of the audience instead of 80% of the audience, that's fine. That was a business model. And that even before social media and the internet, cable news started to fragment the sources of information that people got information from. But moreover, they didn't have to appeal to a wide audience. Now, in general, if people were completely rational, they would assess any position in terms of its costs and benefits. Does it make people better off? Does it make people worse off? What's the evidence? No one is wise or smart or infallible enough to know the answers to every question about policy. You have to follow the evidence, see what people try, see what works, see what doesn't work. In reality, we tend to be tribal people. We don't, the idea that there are objectively correct answers to questions like what causes depressions, what causes wars, what makes people healthy, what makes people happy. That's very unintuitive. That scientific mindset is a gift of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution of the past couple of hundred years. But the human mind has to be educated or has to be convinced that there is a objective scientific method of answering our questions. The natural way of thinking is there are myths that are heroic, that are uplifting, that are morally edifying, that it's good for the children to hear. And so we go with the myth that is most conducive to our own feelings of pride and solidarity. And that means that people tend to divide into tribes, and they tend to get their vision of the truth from what is the dominant narrative within their tribe. Now, I think that's not true when it comes to people's day-to-day lives. When it comes to keeping food in the refrigerator or petrol in the car or how to get the kids off to school, people are very rational. They know how to manipulate cause and effect to do what they want. But when it comes to these big cosmic issues like why is there misfortune and good fortune? Are there depressions? What really happens in the corridors of power? Then truth, falsity, people don't have a sense that you could find out what it is, so you might as well believe the most compelling story.
That is something you touch upon in your book on rationality.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yes.
Right. Okay. Very interesting points there. To go back to common knowledge, let's talk about something that is breaking down today. I am an IR scholar. I've studied political science and international relations all my life. And I could never have imagined that the United States of America would be considering taking over Greenland, or the president of Venezuela would be arrested by the United States military in a covert operation. The conflict between Hamas and Israel at this point of time, the continuing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, it appears that all norms are breaking down and the liberal international project is now a failure. What do you think about that?
Well, it is certainly being threatened by Putin and by Trump. Um, the norm that countries do not go to war except in self-defense and with authorization of the UN Security Council has been rejected both by Putin and Trump. Of course, there were often violations of that in the past, including the United States invading Iraq, for example. So it's not as if that norm was always followed, but still, it was a change from hundreds, maybe thousands of years of history. And that norm, I think, does deserve credit for the decline of interstate and great power war since World War II. Um, I have in my books, The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, I've plotted the rate of battle deaths since 1946, and which way I don't know if my image is reversed or not, so which way is left to right from your point of view, but but it goes down. It's got ups and downs. And in the last couple of years, because of the wars that you pointed out to, Ukraine, Gaza, and even more so in East Africa, in Sudan and Ethiopia, there has been an uptick. So it has not wiped out all the progress that we've made. We're still at a more peaceful time than in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s. We're back to the level of around the late 1990s, but it has gotten worse somewhat. And it could get worse still if that norm really is permanently shattered. It is certainly being threatened. We don't know whether it will reassert itself if, given that Ukraine has been very costly to Russia. Given that we won't, Donald Trump says a lot of things that he doesn't do, and so I still think it's unlikely that uh, the United States will apply military force in Greenland. Um, but there's no question that it's being threatened, and I do think it's a serious risk to world peace.
It just kind of appears that the timeless wisdom of realism, that might is right, has reappeared. And the world has to accept whatever the United States or Russia or China dictate. Over here to the east of Turkey, we have China, we also have Russia, we've got North Korea, multiple countries with nuclear weapons who are going up against each other, including India and Pakistan in the recent conflict, Operation Sindoor and everything. So it just appears that realism is back with a bang, and might is right is going to win.
Well, it's it is back, certainly. I mean, and Trump administration is very explicit about that. They basically said might is right. So the question is, will that prevail? It might. On the other hand, there were good reasons to have the liberal international order. Namely, it prevented war, and wars. As the bumper sticker from my childhood said, war is not healthy for children and other living things. There are huge disadvantages to wars. Countries get tired of them. People revolt against countries that are engaged in war. We're seeing in Iran right now, one of the grievances is that the government of the Ayatollahs has been wasting national resources on proxy wars all over the Middle East at the expense of its people. There could very well be a backlash in the United States if it gets involved in wars and if there are actual American soldiers who are losing their lives. So yes, there's a definite movement toward uh, what's called realism. I think it's a bad term because I don't think it's particularly realistic. I think it's actually quite realistic that measures that avoid stupid wars are a much more realistic path toward prosperity and well-being. But certainly cynical zero-sum competition is embraced by major world leaders. The question is, will the disadvantages then bring the liberal international order back? Certainly, the European Union is still committed to it. The and much of the rest of the world, East Asia. So it's not dead yet, but it is certainly threatened.
I'm going to play the devil's advocate for a minute, and I'm not even sure if I'm acting as the devil right now. But when the liberal international order was set up back in 1945, we had two superpowers, Soviet Russia and the United States. There was a settled norm that democracy is a good system. An entire Cold War was fought between communism and capitalism. At the end of the day, the Soviet Union went down. After that, United States has remained a hegemon, and it has intervened in several situations across the world, starting in 1991 at the Gulf War. Now, most of these wars can be said to be just wars, that they were good in nature, they were justified, they were approved by the UNSC, United Nations Security Council. When they intervened in Iraq and Afghanistan, they came up with a normative reason for it. The truth of that reason is obviously debatable and probably falsified already in the public domain. Now, today, let us look at the situation in Iran. It is quite clear that that regime has been employing proxy wars across the Middle East, and the people have been suffering for a very long time. Iran has been under sanctions for probably 10 years. They have tried to sign the nuclear deal, and then there has been a back and forth between these people. They just don't seem to be coming to an agreement. I am being very simplistic in my phrasing over here. Now, if the United States intervenes in Iran, takes down Khomeini, and brings up a democratic liberal regime, what is wrong with that?
I mean, if there's a military invasion.
Yes.
Well, one of them is that it breaches the norm, and so therefore it opens up the stage to Russia and China invading other countries for whatever reasons, which may not be for the promotion of democracy. And the other is that invading a country to try to establish a liberal democracy, to put it mildly, does not have a good track record, as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, of course, Iran is not the same as Iraq, and not the same as Afghanistan, a very different tradition. But it would be a gamble with with potential for very high costs. Also, if countries don't like to be invaded generally, and if especially if the invasion is either unsuccessful militarily, that is, the invader suffers a lot of casualties, uh, or there's an occupation that is opposed, as in Iraq, because the other country is seen as invaders, where there's constant terrorism, sabotage, improvised explosive devices, then what starts out as having an admirable goal may not achieve that goal. Now, it might, if there was a possibility of a clean coup resulting in the establishment of a liberal democracy, then that might be outweigh the cost of breaching the international norm. But Iran has never been a liberal democracy. There may be impediments in divisions among Iranians. So it'd be a huge gamble and kind of an inappropriate use of force given norms that are probably good norms overall. Now, there may be other ways of helping the Iranian people to bring down the regime, such as satellites that restore internet service, internet access, um, the ways of encouraging the protests that are not seen as external intervention, which could be an excuse for the regime to crack down, saying they're defending themselves against a foreign power, which is another downside of intervention. So it's a complex calculus, and it would seem, given our experience and given what we know and given the cost, that invading to affect regime change is a risky business. Even in Venezuela, where no one misses Maduro, he has not been replaced by a liberal Democrat. He's been replaced by another dictator.
His vice president, I think.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, here's the thing though. Common knowledge generators can be captured by a dictatorship. You mentioned the fantastic example of China in your book, that the people of China have traded in political freedoms uh, for ease of convenience and a higher GDP per capita, which is a fact. Now, common knowledge generators across dictatorships are usually acquiescent to the dictator in power. And one independent observer can obviously notice this. Now, I find it hard to believe that in such a situation, where most common knowledge generators are not working, not doing the job they should be, there's no guy waving a white paper in the middle of a corner where KGB can arrest him. There's actually nothing going on there. So I really find it hard to believe that an external power cannot support a people who are living under a dictatorship. Maybe that makes me a radical Democrat, but it is really frustrating to see people living in such horrible conditions sometimes. In Iran,
No,
with the reason. Go ahead.
no, I agree. Now, in China, it's not clear that the people were actually given that choice. It's what they got. It is certainly true that I think that people will prefer um, a strong, stable government, even if it is authoritarian, over anarchy and chaos and warlords and gangs. So, given the choice between anarchy and tyranny, people go for tyranny. And then they may be right in the sense that more people are killed by anarchy than by tyranny over the course of history. On the other hand, we know from the success of democracies that you don't have to make that. It isn't a complete trade-off. There are lots of wealthy countries that are also stable, and for all of China's success, someone once wisecracked that it's the citizens of the People's Republic of China are the poorest Chinese people in the world. That in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in all of the expatriate Chinese communities in Singapore, in the United States, Chinese people do very much better than they do in People's Republic of China. They do better now than they did under Mao, but we don't know how much better they could do if there was a stable democracy. Taiwan's a pretty nice place to live, and Switzerland and Norway all have stability and affluence. Uh, but anyway, back to since you did bring up that Soviet era joke about common knowledge, I may as well repeat it since you alluded to it. Because it's there are many cases in which, even though common knowledge is in some ways is an abstract, difficult concept, we have an intuitive sense of it, and it plays out in many movies, novels, jokes, situation comedies, as in this joke from the Soviet Union era. A man is handing out leaflets in Red Square, and of course the KGB arrest him. They bring him back to headquarters, only to discover that he's been handing out blank sheets of paper. And they confront him. What is the meaning of this? And he says, "What's there to say? It's so obvious." Now, the point of the joke was that he actually was being subversive. He was generating common knowledge. In a dictatorship, there no one is deluded that they're happy, but no one can be sure that the other citizens feel as aggrieved by the government as they do. And that's what dictatorships try to do. They try to prevent common knowledge. Merely by handing out blank leaflets, this protester was generating common knowledge, even though he wasn't adding to anyone's specific knowledge. He was saying, you're not the only one with a grievance against the government, and the fact that you see all the other people accepting the blank sheets of paper means that you know that they know that everyone else is angry at the government as well. And in fact, there are many cases in China and in Russia in which people have been arrested for carrying blank signs or handing out blank sheets of paper. So life imitated the joke.
Yes, you did mention somewhere in one of your podcasts that an academic should do that at a conference.
Yes, for maybe that would be a way of puncturing some of the repression of ideas in academia.
You have an entire chapter devoted to that. But
Yes.
before we go there, I want to ask you something that many people have been asking me. This is a passed down question, so to say, not exactly mine. Now, the human mind seems to be attracted to pessimism and cynicism a lot nowadays. And even though in your books, Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, you show how human progress has evolved over centuries. We have moved from a tribal era to living in luxuries that monarchs of Middle Ages couldn't even imagine. Now, when you try to explain this to somebody, it's extremely difficult. The world is bad for different reasons for different groups of people. Why is that happening, and how do you convince somebody that it's a good era to live in? I don't want to
Yes.
be born in 1930s.
No, and or before. I mean, as like to say, would you prefer your surgery with or without anesthesia? For example, would you like dentistry in the 21st century or the 19th century? Um, so yes, so one part of the explanation is there's a widespread pattern in polling that people are much more optimistic about their own lives than about the country as a whole. Reliably, if you ask people about the quality of schools, they'll say the quality of schools in the country is terrible. What about your kid's school? Oh, it's actually pretty good. If you ask them, is the country safe? They'll say, no, there's crime everywhere and muggings and knifings and shootings. And they say, what about your neighborhood? Do you feel safe? And they say, well, yeah, I feel pretty safe. So partly there's a dissociation between people's vision of the whole country and their own lives. That is driven in part by what cognitive psychologists call the availability bias, namely, or the availability heuristic, namely people judge probability and risk and danger by salient examples, by narratives, by images, and that's what the news delivers. The news is selectively biased toward the negative, not necessarily because editors prefer negative stories, although they do. But on top of that overt bias, the mere fact that they report newsworthy events means there's a built-in bias toward the negative. And that's because anything that happens suddenly is much more likely to be bad than good. A shooting, a terrorist attack, a natural disaster, a man-made disaster. Those are news. Things that are improvements, such as the decline in extreme poverty, which has been one of the most important events in the history of humanity, that extreme poverty has gone from 90% of humanity to less than 9%. The decline in crime, the decline in war, the gradual rise of human rights. Those tend not to be reported in the news because they're not discrete events that happened on a Thursday morning in October. They creep up a few percentage points a year, and so they're never reported. In fact, sometimes the reporting can convey the exact opposite impression. Imagine that you've got a curve that goes up with occasional setbacks, and then up with a setback, and then up with a setback. And the only thing that gets reported is the setback because it's news. This year, for the first time in 10 years, life expectancy got shorter instead of longer. Well, if every time that happens, there's a news story, but there isn't a news story about the 9 years out of 10 in which life expectancy goes up, because it isn't news, it's the same as last year, then people get the systematically wrong impression about global trends. Finally, I mentioned that there is, on top of that, a negativity bias among journalists. But there's a negativity bias in everyone, in that overall, bad emotions are felt more strongly than good emotions. There's a greater number of negative emotions than positive emotions. We remember the things that went wrong recently better than things that went right. So human psychology is already tilted toward the negative. The very possibility of progress is a very recent development in human history. For thousands of years, there was imperceptible progress. There would be, people did invent things did change, but over very short periods of time. The idea of a country getting better or the world getting better within the span of a human lifetime, something that only began to happen pretty much after the Industrial Revolution, itself following the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. So I don't think our intuitions were prepared by evolution for the very concept of global long-term progress.
You were right about that. I've only just started teaching, when I talk to people about Enlightenment, or when I used to during my undergrad, Enlightenment era just appears as a footnote to Marxism and realism over here. And I think in a lot of curriculums nowadays across the world. So if you ask people what exactly Enlightenment is, what are the benefits, what has it actually given us, nobody knows. Even the Enlightenment ideals of reason, science, humanism are absent from discussions today. And I really don't know why. It's stupid to me.
Well, you're right. You have pointed out another factor that I had not brought up, which is that in a lot of the intellectual establishment, there's a built-in cultural pessimism that far more leading intellectuals are deep pessimists, partly because of the hegemony of ideas from Nietzsche and Heidegger and the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and postmodernism and Foucault. But at least in the humanities, there was a takeover. It's not exactly clear why, possibly because that was the dominant school when there was a huge expansion of academia starting in the 1960s, and they got the positions of power and then used that to keep hiring people who were like them. Partly because these are all positions that flatter intellectuals, namely, we intellectuals see how everyone else has been ruining the world, and we're here to point that out, compared to, say, the inventors, the technologists, the business people, the politicians who actually make clean water go through the pipes and kids get inoculated. And so I think there's a temptation among scholars, particularly in the humanities and the softer social sciences, to elevate themselves as prophets and critics, possibly because of just status competition among elites. that every society has military and religious and political and technological and commercial elites, as well as intellectual and artistic elites, and they all compete for power and prestige. And so it's part of the status game of intellectual elites to put down the rival elites.
But it's a very dangerous game to play, I think. In my undergrad, I was associated with a Marxist group. I used to work with them. I used to go to slums, do the teaching. I actually did everything that a good Marxist was supposed to do. And suddenly, me and my best friend, I was in a girl gang. We were all rationalists, objectivists, very rebellious. So we used to ask them just this one simple question: when is the revolution happening? Every time it's going to be pushed to a later date. Okay, not today, maybe in 5 years, not today, maybe in 15 years. And I remember this one point that after a particular protest, we were sitting in a park and we kept on asking that leader, when is the revolution happening? And he just started calling us privileged uh, city girls who really don't understand what is going on in the world, and we should read Marx and Mao and Lenin. But what he did not know that I had read Lenin at that point of time, and Lenin talked about the vanguard party. To me, that seems a very prophet-like approach to life, that I will tell you what is good for you. And I think that is extraordinarily stupid because, as you just mentioned, people are rational about their lives. And I think if you leave them alone, they will notice statistical trends, because rationality, in my opinion, is built in the human brain. Uh, you are a cognitive scientist. Don't you think that would be the case? And this kind of an approach creates deference to authority. Because if a professor tells you, go ahead and read Mao's practical approach to life, or go and read about overproduction theory by Lenin, you're going to feel a little bit out of place and you're going to go back and read it, and then you're going to get bored and close it. But
Yes, well,
I read it.
uh-huh. Well,
I
what's also astonishing, so there are a couple of things. One is what's remarkable is that Marxism has been tried. Now, of course, a defender of Marxism say it hasn't really been tried anywhere, but it's certainly the people who implemented it claimed they were implementing Marxism. And this is a massive experiment, a global experiment with a very clear outcome. Namely, the Soviet Union was a disaster. The imposition of communism on Eastern Europe was a disaster. The imposition of communism in Venezuela was a disaster. The imposition of communism in Maoist China was a disaster. Disaster in terms of both poverty and oppression and genocide and stupid wars. So the world has told us what happens under communism, and it's a sign of how out of touch intellectuals can be, that there are still people who defend it, despite the entire world giving a very clear-cut answer. One more is, would you rather live in North Korea or South Korea? Would you rather live in the old East Germany or West Germany? We have an experimental group and a matched control group in terms of culture, language, and geography, and the answer is crystal clear. So this is a sign of, I think, the a pathology of intellectual life that Marxism can persist. The other is, you did call attention to one of the appeals of Marxism, though, and more generally of uh, a strong influence of um, government guided by intellectuals, which is that there's certain kinds of reforms that you can state as principles, you can articulate them verbally as propositions, like equality, human rights, democracy. But there's other kinds of progress that take place in massive distributed networks of millions of people, none of whom implement some policy, but collectively there is an order, an organization that's beneficial. So that can happen organically through, for example, the development of a language. No one designed the English language. It's just hundreds of millions of English speakers. They coin new words, they forget old words, they try to make themselves clear, and we get the English language and the other 5,000 languages spoken on Earth. Likewise, a market economy. is something where knowledge is distributed. You don't have a central planner deciding how many shoes of size 8 will be needed in a particular city, but rather information is conveyed by prices, which are adjusted according to supply and demand. And you've got a distributed network of exchange of information that can result in an emergent benefit. Now, intellectuals tend to hate that. They like rules of language, of correct grammar. They like top-down economic planning. They like cultural change that satisfies particular ideals described by intellectuals. And so rival sources of organization, like commerce, like culture, traditional culture, tend to be downplayed by intellectuals. And this can be magnified by the fact that many dictatorships give a privileged role to intellectuals, which may be why over the course of the 20th century and probably continuing to the present, there has not been a dictator that has not had fans among intellectuals, including the mullahs and ayatollahs of Iran, but also the communist dictators, Mao and Castro, even Stalin in his day. Um, and every other dictator has had actually often fawning praise from Western intellectuals.
I have never understood that phenomena, why that would happen. The exact opposite of Marxist theory in academia or in general life gives us populism today. At least that's what I think. It's Marxism versus populism. The centrists today just do not exist. And if they do, the other side calls them either left liberals or fascist, which
Yes,
is
right.
just funny at the end of the day.
Although what we have increasingly dominating intellectual life, at least in the West, this may be different in India, is a kind of hybrid of Marxism and racial and gender identitarianism. Because Marx had no use for race. I mean, it was just a nuisance. It was a distraction, and all the classical Marxists. It was all economic classes. But thanks to in part, the school of critical theory, the Frankfurt School, the rhetoric and constructs of Marxism, of class conflict, got applied to racial and gender conflict. And so there's still an oppressor class and an oppressed class, but instead of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, it's now the cisgender heterosexual white males against the women, the people of color, the LGBTQ community, and so on.
It's the same in India. The theory is called intersectionality, I think,
Yes,
nowadays.
intersectionality.
When I first heard about it, uh, oppressed and oppressor, I have no idea which class I belong to, because in India, I'd probably be called the oppressor, and abroad, I'll be,
Oppressor.
yeah, I'm the oppressor
Well,
somehow.
you could do well here. You could tick a number of boxes. Uh,
No, thank you.
okay.
I can do my things on merit, I think, at this point anyway. I have that much
Yes,
confidence.
I think so. Well, of course, and that is, I mean, you've just also pinpointed one of the biggest flaws of identitarian politics, namely, brilliant people are in a position where their qualifications can be questioned because people can say, well, did they really deserve it? Or is it just because, he's black or she's a woman or he's gay? Whereas in a true meritocracy, there's no question. People got there because they prevailed in a competition for the best. That is one of the bad side effects of racial and gender preferences. It puts people under a cloud of suspicion.
It does, and it's a matter of concern the way this manifests in society. Because either you're, and I never understood when the white man became everybody's enemy, if I'm being completely honest.
It began I think it began in the 70s in academia with the dominance of critical theory and postmodernism in the humanities.
I think there's a direct linkage, but you would know better than me. How did it turn into the woke culture of the 21st century? I'm gonna state an anecdote here because this actually happened and it changed a lot of things that I thought I knew about social science. Back in 2020, during the COVID era, in one of our Zoom catch-ups, my supervisor, Professor Amitabh Mattu, asked us, "What is woke?" Now, at that point of time, Twitter told me woke is good, and woke is an expression of your identity. And after a couple of years, I realized woke is about intersectionality, and somehow it is a binary between oppressed and oppressor. And it's got several other connotations to it, including leading to a cancel culture and deplatforming of certain individuals. How do you look at it? I know you have devoted a chapter, so I think we should talk about the cancel culture a little bit here.
Yeah, so cancel culture is one of the phenomena that has surrounded the what's sometimes called the Great Awakening. It's a humorous term based on the Great Awakening, which was an era in American history where there was um, a huge multiplication of Protestant churches and of religious fervor in the 19th century. That was the Great Awakening. And so the joke is it's the Great Awakening of probably starting maybe around 2014, but then it really exploded in 2020 in the United States with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Um, but anyway, cancel culture, which is not restricted to the left, to wokeism. And in fact, in the United States in the last year, we've seen an eruption of cancel culture from the populist MAGA Trumpian right uh, especially after the killing of Charlie Kirk, where the same things that were happening in woke culture, namely, someone would have a tweet or a comment that seemed disrespectful of the dominant ideology, and they would get threatened, they would get censored, they would get fired. So in my book, and when everyone knows that everyone knows, one of the chapters is called The Canceling Instinct. It's a bit of a play on my book, The Language Instinct. It just asks the question, since it is not only the woke left, but it can also be the MAGA right, and to say nothing of the fascist right or the Nazi right to repress speech. Question is why? Uh, why do we feel the urge to shut up people we disagree with? Particularly since one of the principles of the Enlightenment and of science and democracy is that you need to have free speech because none of us is infallible. The only way we make progress is that everyone expresses an opinion, other people are free to criticize those opinions, and it is in the crucible of debate and criticism that we see which ideas are good, which ones are true, which ones are errors that we should discard. I suggest the reason that there is such an urge to cancel is that we all are, we live by moral norms, by not just by laws where the police will arrest you and put you on trial and put you in jail if you break a law. And that happens. But we have many more norms of how we live our lives where people don't do something because everyone knows you don't do it. Why does everyone know? Well, everyone knows that everyone else knows that you don't do it. You don't walk around naked. You don't eat, mashed potatoes with your hands. You don't insult people to their faces. You don't point out if someone is overweight or has a speech impediment. There are dozens of these norms, and some of the norms are you don't make racist comments. You don't make comments that demean women or gay people. What upholds these norms? Common knowledge. They exist because everyone knows they exist, which means that if it appears that a norm is threatened, crucially in a public arena where it could be common knowledge, then there's an urge to then punish that person, but also publicly. That is in an arena of common knowledge, that is where everyone can see the punishment and everyone can see everyone else seeing the punishment. That's what's necessary to prop up a norm. And that, I think, gives rise to the urge to censor and cancel, often in highly public ways. Now, in the old days, it used to be that there were public hangings and public crucifixions and burnings at the stake. The electronic equivalent is the internet petition with 600 signatures or the social media shaming mob. But I think the underlying psychology is the same. Now, some cases this could be positive. That is, it really is good that we don't insult each other to our faces, that we don't tell racist jokes, which were very common when I grew up. On the other hand, in arenas like science, democracy, the rule of law, the truth is more important than social harmony. And the whole point of scholarship, of academia, of science is that you find the truth even when the truth seems uncomfortable. And so cancel culture can get in the way of our collective effort to acquire knowledge. I give an
I agree.
example. I give an example of a story. It turns out to be an apocryphal story from the 19th century, where when Darwin's theory of natural selection started to become known, according to the story, a woman, in some versions, she was the wife of a vicar, a minister, and she said, "Descended from apes. My dear, let us hope it is not true, but if it is, let us hope it not become widely known." She could have said, "Let us hope it not become common knowledge or commonly known," and that would perfectly make the point. That is, the fear is often not that some idea be be known, but that everyone know that it's known, because the intuition is that that would threaten some sacred norm or value.
This relates directly to Robert Orman's agreement theorem. I'll admit that this is the first time I read about it and I actually looked up the paper. It's very interesting. You have to go from one argument to the other. Today, when everything seems to be changing with artificial intelligence, neurotechnology, biotechnology, I don't think that we should be debating basic foundational issues of human civilization, specifically norms. Because if you have cancel culture on the right, you have cancel culture on the left, and both of them lead to different kinds of norms that would be input into these machines and therefore into different laws, because norms make laws at the end of the day. It seems really dangerous. And at this point, developing countries are norm takers. We clearly don't have any big artificial intelligence company or any other type of technology growing, except maybe in China. They can dictate norms, but we can't. So cancel culture becomes important to me in that aspect as well. Notwithstanding the fact that it lets go of all kinds of rational analysis and dictates the truth to everyone around it. Over here, the dominant syllabus, as I mentioned before in one of my emails also, is Marxism and realism. And if you go against it, you're basically asked to shut up. And that has happened to many people I know, even to me. You cannot be a rationalist. You cannot say there is one objective truth, even in the matter of science. And I think that's dangerous, because that is what makes us defer to authority without questioning it, thereby creating dictatorships. Because when you're dealing with any proposition, the first thing you have to ask is this correct? Is this good for me? Is this good for society? And when I see people around me, they just have religious reference to Marxism, reverence to Marxism and realism. And I find this across the world nowadays. You've posted many analysis of curriculums across the world on your Twitter handle, on your X handle many times. And there's always a dominance of critical theory. Now, why do you think that is? Where did this come from?
The dominance of critical theory in academia and among intellectuals?
Yes.
Yes, it's a good question. I don't think we really know the answer. So some of it may just be a historical accident, namely that there was an expansion of academia at a time when this was the fad. Some of it may be that it flatters intellectuals themselves. It gives them a privileged role compared to other cultural elites, such as business, technology, government. So it flatters the intellectual himself or herself. Um, I suspect and as we've mentioned, it does privilege what academics and intellectuals do, namely formulate explicit verbal propositions as opposed to alternatives like markets, like culture, like popular democracy.
Over here, I just think we import it without context. And by context, I don't mean applying it to the social conditions of this country, but rather untested import of ideas of intellectuals from the West, which I find kind of strange. I wanted to talk about why people are single nowadays. I would have asked about
Oh,
human nature, but that's for another day.
yes,
I sent you an article, and how do you think
yes,
common
which I
knowledge
read it.
fits into that area? Why do you think so many youngsters are single?
Yes, it's a good question. I'm not sure that common knowledge is is an important part of the answer, but some of it is that women no longer depend on the economic contributions of men for their livelihood, as was true, say, in my mother's era, where women were not professionally trained, and so just to pay the rent, they had to be married. Um, the now with women are not only are women better educated, um, but the economy has shifted to favor the kinds of skills that women as opposed to men have. And just as women have been rising, men have been sinking because of the decline in blue collar work. Also, there have been trends in culture that have favored women's temperaments. Men have been um, distracted by internet gaming and gambling and pornography, um, and are less desirable as marriage partners. Women with more economic power have are more likely to um, raise their standards for what they seek in a man. In my parents' generation, it was not uncommon for a woman to marry a man with much less education, um, and sometimes less intelligence. This was not uncommon among my parents' friends. The man often had, and this is in a middle class community, the man would have a high school degree, but he immediately went into a small business, sometimes a family business, sometimes he started a business. The criterion was, does he make a living? No one cared about education. That has changed with the result that the pool means that there are fewer men that satisfy the criteria of women. This was mentioned in that article that you shared with me. Uh, Also, with more sexual freedom, it means that people don't have to get married simply to have sex, which is again true in my parents' generation. But there's a process that has uh, been in place through the baby boomer generation, but then accelerating in the millennials and Generation Z. Um, and for other reasons, I think the generation of men are also incapable of socially skilled interaction, partly because they've grown up with screens instead of face-to-face interaction. There is some fear that a sexual encounter could result in an accusation of rape or sexual harassment. There is so much pornography that for an increasing number of men, that is um, uh, an outlet for what in the past would have to have been satisfied by actual human contact. A number of things, and the article that you shared with me from The Economist, I mean, lists them, I think very skillfully. And it's not clear how to reverse it. It's increasing the economic prospects of men, an educational system that is less feminized, more encouraging of male achievement might be one. Another could be change in norms, and here this is common knowledge. Um, is it among women, is it going to be a sign of low status to be with a man who has less education than you? Men from time immemorial, but happy to marry women with less education than them. Women don't. That immediately reduces the marriage pool. Maybe that's a norm that should change. Go back to the norm in my parents' generation.
No, let's not do that.
Okay, but
We're
let's not
happy.
do
Yeah,
that.
we're happy to marry men who are not as educated as us. It's fine. They just have to be nice and kind at this point of time.
Well, no, that's right. Exactly. To be nice and kind. And that should be, perhaps that should be common knowledge that the pathway to a happy life is to be with someone who is kind and generous and respectful and considerate. and that the professional credentials maybe should not be as important.
They don't
Although I got to
matter
say, it's not
much.
just that, because one of the things the article pointed out is that women increasingly in online dating marketplace insist that men be 6 feet tall or higher, which means they've already ruled out 90% of the male population. I'm certainly
Okay,
not
so
an I'm not an
oh,
expert in this area, but as a psychologist, I'm interested in everything.
thank you
So
very much for joining me. You know, it's my first podcast, so I'm sorry if I made any mistakes.
you did not. It's
Thank you very
thoroughly
much.
is
I'm going to
stimulating, high level, enjoyable. Thank you very much for having me on.